Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for coming out this beautiful sunny afternoon in Kitscoty. It's a real honor for me on behalf of the Alberta Prosperity Project to present to you today. Now, I have to say something which wasn't planned in my speech, but this area in the Lloydminster area has been very, very close to my heart. And there's somebody here today that I didn't know would be coming, and her name is Glenda. Some of you may know Glenda as the daughter of Ray Nelson. Ray Nelson was a very good friend of mine, and he was at one time the oldest person in the world to have had a heart transplant. I just had to acknowledge that. And you know, when we did him, I think he was 79, and he passed on when he was 91, so it was a good decision to make. He was a wonderful man. Now, my task today is to convince you to want to protect your interests, your freedoms, and your prosperity. And I'm going to tell you how you can do that in a bit. But before I start, I'd like to pose a couple of questions. How many people here are pleased with the performance of our federal government? What about the Prime Minister? I see no hands for those of you on the front. You don't see in the back. What about the performance of our provincial government? Once again, not a lot of enthusiasm there. Well, how many people here are concerned then about their individual freedoms and their prosperity? So the majority of people here are concerned. Well, you're not alone. I don't know if many of you saw the Angus Reid survey that was reported on January the 12th, wherein 87% of Albertans polled were concerned about inflation and the cost of living. And so you should be concerned. And a few weeks prior to that, Jack Mintz, the chair of public policy at the University of Calgary, came out with an article in the National Post on November the 11th, in which he pointed out that ending our oil and gas industry will result in a 1/3 reduction. Does this sound okay? In a 1/3 reduction in the average income of Albertans. So, ladies and gentlemen, we truly are facing an existential threat to our very way of life, to our individual freedoms, and a threat to our prosperity if we do nothing. But I'm here today to tell you that the future could be incredibly brilliant if we come together for common cause and do something that has never been done before. And what that is, ladies and gentlemen, is for us to unite. That is the purpose of our project, to unite all Albertans, businesses, and organizations to protect their interests, their individual freedoms and rights, your individual freedoms and rights, your prosperity, and self-determination by enabling Alberta to chart a new path forward. Now, before I get into what that new path forward is, Alberta is currently in a real dilemma. And that dilemma that we are in is not just a threat to our prosperity, but it's to our very way of life. The injustices that we faced, the Great Reset that is coming, we need to stand up against that. Now, let's look at freedoms and prosperity this way. How many people here would like freedom from being overgoverned, overregulated, and overtaxed? How many people would like to have the freedom from wokeness, cancel culture, critical race theory, tearing down monuments, rewriting history? What about freedom from the Great Reset? And do you all really know what the Great Reset is? All right. And what about freedom from corrupt government? Right. Think of the freedoms that we've lost already. Do we have freedom of speech? Not so much. You can't really have a conversation with someone who disagrees with you without them calling you a racist or an imbecile. What about the freedom of assembly and association. Look at what's happened in the last 2 years. That could happen again anytime. What about the freedom of families to be the moral, cultural, and spiritual pillar of society, to pass on values, principles, accountability, responsibility, knowledge, critical thinking to future generations? That's been usurped by much in the education system, which is why parents often aren't told what's going on with their kids, right? That's happening. What about the freedom to own and enjoy property? How many people here own their home with no mortgage? Just raise your hand. Just don't pay your taxes and you'll find out who really owns your home. We don't really have property rights. And what about freedom to travel? There's another one that's been lost. You know, when you think about that, I'm not sure you're aware, but the federal government is intending on limiting how far you can travel by train, plane, and automobile, all in the name of climate. So, you know, when you think about it, we are losing every single day under the current form of government that we are living under. So let's just take a moment and just talk about the future. It's not often you know the future, but with the Great Reset, we know the future. Fundamentally, the Great Reset simply is a very influential movement by the global elites of the World Economic Forum and the United Nations under Agenda 2030 to reset the global economy and change the fabric of society using banks, government agencies, and along with environmental, social, and governance metrics to control billions of people, what you can buy, where you can buy it, how much you can buy, where you can travel, how far you can travel. You'll be controlled by a digital ID. They'll know where you are, and you'll be given permissions based on a credit score, and you've heard about this. It's well publicized, to determine, based on your credit score, what you can actually do with your life. And then what about the concept of that Great Reset to introduce also that one world currency? That one world currency can immediately be shut down for any particular individual whose credit score doesn't meet the threshold. Similarly, you'll own nothing and be happy. That's what Klaus Schwab says, head of the World Economic Forum. And I don't know if you saw recently, he was very proud to announce that Justin Trudeau and his cabinet has been educated at the World Economic Forum. So you can see what's coming if we do nothing. Well, let's look at this from the perspective of prosperity. And we'll look at it briefly through the lens of the energy industry and confiscatory federal tax policy. So when you consider the energy industry, I mean, Alberta was massively blessed by an enormous reserve of energy in our oil sands and conventional oil and gas, all kinds of minerals, etc. But yet, by 2030, 2035, the federal government wants to end, according to the UN WEF 2030 agenda, they want to end our oil and gas industry. But they want to import oil from countries that don't have anywhere near the environmental or social standards that we do. How does that even make sense? Of course it doesn't make sense. We're vilified for climate change in this province when, like I said, we've got the best environmental social standards in the world, but we're also blessed in the country with a carbon sink of 318 billion or more trees, muskeg, and farmland, agricultural land, that soaks up that CO2. Now, I'm not someone who says that climate change isn't occurring. I'm just saying that I haven't seen the evidence to prove that it's man-made. Very similar, the magnetic North Pole is moving as well. So at some point, the environmentalists are probably going to say, we're responsible for the fact that the magnetic North Pole is moving. In any case, I'm just making a silly analogy, but this is really where this is at. You know, it always intrigues me if you try and speak to someone who has been brainwashed with respect to CO2 and climate change. If you ask them, how does it make sense, for example, to have a gas plant or a coal plant that produces energy, a certain amount of energy, call it X amount of energy, and replace that with a wind farm, in which, and that sits on 4 acres, those gas plant and coal plant, but a wind farm, to produce the same amount of energy when the wind's blowing, you have to have wind turbines on 2,500 acres. So how is that ecologically sound management of and stewardship of the environment? It doesn't make sense to me anyhow. And of course, all of that technology, the wind turbines, of course, require greasing. Where does that come from? You know where it comes from. And none of it is biodegradable, so it all has to be buried. I think what's even more maddening for me is the Allen Report. How many of you know about the Allen Report? Some of you do. For those of you who do not, Steve Allen is a forensic accountant, and he was commissioned by Jason Kenney, the provincial government, to look into foreign government spending that was used to interfere with the development and transport of our natural resources. So between 2003 and 2019, $1.3 billion was spent to shutter our oil and gas industry. Where did that funding come from? Well, it came from other countries. It came from many other businesses. It came from our own federal government to these various environmental societies such as the Suzuki Society, Tides Foundation, etc. So this is the kind of thing that has been going on. Now, why would other countries and other businesses fund the elimination of our oil and gas industry? It's simple, it's competition. So here was an opportunity, and other countries, other businesses piled on. And they benefit if our energy industry is gone. So let's look at what's going to happen. You already know what I said earlier with respect to the elimination of our oil and gas industry in terms of what Jack Mintz said. That is the direction. That is the future. That's what we know if we keep doing the same things that we've done before. So we have to be thinking differently. Similarly, let's look at prosperity with respect to confiscatory tax policy. So our federal taxes roughly are about $60 billion a year, of which we get back 27, roughly. So, and as you know, for pensioners out there, we overfund the pension system by $3 billion a year. Can you imagine how much your pensions would be improved if you had control of that $3 billion, and how much benefit Alberta society would benefit by the retention of all of that amazing wealth, just in terms of lower taxes, investment, massive investment. You know, when Ralph resigned in 2006, we had no debt, $36 billion in cash and assets, the number 2 GDP per capita region in the world, and the lowest unemployment. You know, this is definitely achievable for Alberta to be the lowest taxed region again at some point in the future if we do something different, something that has never been done before. So what are our options? There are really only 3, ladies and gentlemen. One is the status quo. Do nothing. And I like to think of where we are right now as Alberta is a canoe on the Niagara River. And as the inhabitants of that canoe, you're the inhabitants, get closer and closer to the falls, you start to hear the rush of the waterfall. At some point, you've got an opportunity to paddle like crazy and get to the shore. A little bit later, it's too late and over you go. Well, we don't have a whole lot of time, ladies and gentlemen. The amount of time that we have, we need to make something happen as early as the 2023 election. So our options are the status quo. I'm going to assume that nobody here is in favor of the status quo, right? Then we have two other options. One option is, can we fix Alberta's circumstances in Confederation? Or does Alberta need to chart a new path forward? Now, let me pose a question. How many people would prefer that Alberta remain in Canada, but with a much better deal, greater control of its wealth and the programs that are necessary for society to operate? How many people would prefer that Alberta stay in Canada, but with a better deal? Okay, there are some people. That's good. And how many people would prefer that Alberta get out of Dodge? All right, okay. So there's a majority. And that seems to be the prevailing opinion as we go around the province. Some of you might remember that a mainstream research poll on October the 19th indicated that 47% of decided voters were already in favor of independence. It may be much higher now. I haven't seen any more recent polls than that. Now, here's the deal. I think it's really important to understand, very briefly, the difficulty, if not the impossibility, of fixing Alberta's circumstances within Confederation. And we're going to examine this prospect or this possibility through the lens of history, as well as the structural imbalance, and as well as the constitutional hurdles. So let's think of fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation using ending equalization as the metaphor for fixing Alberta's circumstances in Confederation. How many people here think it's possible to end equalization within Confederation? Not so many right now. Okay. Well, here's the thing. Let's think just very briefly about a couple of key points of history. I'm going to make 3 points. The first is that you all know that Alberta was incorporated September 1, 1905, thanks to the efforts of Sir Clifford Sifton, who was the Minister of the Interior in the Liberal government of Sir Wilfrid Laurier. But he said something in 1904 which is really prescient. And it's important to understand what he said then to understand why we are where we are at now. So what he said then was this: we desire, and all Canadian patriots desire. Now, Canadian patriots in 1904 were the people living in the regions of Quebec and Ontario. So we desire, and all Canadian patriots desire, that the great trade of the prairies is Alberta's wealth, shall go to enrich our people, where? In the east, to build up our factories and our places of work, and in every legitimate way contribute to our prosperity. Not to the prosperity of Alberta and the West in general, but to the east. And you know what? We started off as a colony in 1905. We're a colony in 2022, and we continue to be pillaged and plundered. And no federal or provincial government has ever been able to protect Alberta's interests or prosperity in 116 years. Think about that. Think about that when you think about how we can change the direction of this province. So keep that in mind. Now, many of you will know, this is the third point I want to make. I'm going to go back to the midpoint, roughly the midpoint, late 70s. Alberta, many of you will know this, Alberta was becoming the center of economic power in Canada, right? There was massive wealth moving to Alberta, massive demographic shifts. In fact, Alberta was becoming the economic center of power in Canada. And to that end, the 5 major banks were intending on moving their head offices to Calgary, and one did, CIBC. But what was happening in Alberta collided with what was going on in Quebec, the Quebec secessionist movement. So no matter what you think of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, or his finance minister Marc Lalonde, or the financial elites of Bay Street and Montreal, they came up with a brilliant plan, and that was the national energy policy, ostensibly to transfer wealth from Alberta to poorer regions in the country so they would have similar social programs. Don't let anybody ever tell you that that was really the truth of the matter. There were two real reasons why that happened. One was to prevent Alberta from ever again becoming the center of economic power in Canada, and two was to prevent Quebec from leaving Canada using Alberta's wealth by buying Quebec's loyalty to Canada. And that's why one of the reasons why $2 of every $3 of equalization goes to Quebec. So if you just know that little bit of history, ask yourself the question, can we end equalization? And if you think so, think of the structural electoral imbalance. Many of you know we don't have representation by population. It wouldn't really matter anyhow, but we don't. For example, PEI gets one elected MP for every 40,000 population. Alberta, one for every 130,000 population. What that really means, ladies and gentlemen, is two things. Every federal election will be decided by voter-rich Quebec and Ontario. It's number one. And number two, it doesn't matter the federal party in power. They will always pander to the wishes of voter-rich Quebec and Ontario at Alberta's expense. Now, you know a little bit about history there. Some of it you already knew. And the electoral imbalance. You still think you can end equalization or any other program? You can't. Now, but if you think you can, then let's look at the constitutional hurdles. There are 5. The first is, to end equalization or any other egregious program, you'd have to have a majority vote in the House of Commons to open the Constitution and change it. Vote in the Senate, and then you'd have to have 7 of 10 provincial legislatures also voting in favor of Alberta. And how do you think Quebec would vote? And then there's the 4th hurdle, and that is Quebec thinks it has a veto. And the way the Supreme Court, and by the way, they didn't even sign the Constitution. I don't know if many of you knew that, the 1982 Constitution. But Quebec thinks that it has a veto, and the way the Supreme Court twisted itself into a pretzel to approve a carbon tax, which was absolutely against the Constitution with respect to the right of provinces to develop and transport their natural resources unfettered, you can be sure that if it became a constitutional issue about them having a veto, how the Supreme Court would decide. But that brings up the Supreme Court itself, which is the 5th hurdle. And when you understand the constitution of the Supreme Court, you realize the impossibility of changing anything to benefit Alberta, because there's no question that there would be constitutional battles to try and end equalization or these other programs. And the Supreme Court, the way it's constituted, with 3 justices appointed from Quebec, 3 from Ontario, 1 from the Maritimes, 2 from all of Western Canada, it's crystal clear how a Supreme Court would vote. The East versus the West, what do you think? The East versus the West. There's no question in my mind. There's 2 other points here to be made. There were 2 attempts to change the Constitution, Charlottetown Accord and Meech Lake. Neither of them worked. They both failed. So when we look at all of these things that I've just said, in order to fix Alberta's circumstances in Confederation, to cut a better deal within Canada, it's an extremely difficult task, if not impossible. Similarly, is it possible for Alberta to chart a new path forward as an independent sovereign nation? Right now, the answer is no. So both of those paradigms, whether you want Alberta to stay in Canada or you want Alberta to become a new constitutional republic, a separate nation, you can't achieve either of those objectives. But folks, you guys can make something happen that can bring about either of those 2 paradigms. Because what you can do is you can give the government of Alberta the leverage that it needs to fix Alberta's circumstances in Confederation or chart a new path forward. What is that leverage? The only leverage is a successful referendum on independence, because that gives Alberta the moral and legal legitimacy to chart a new path forward. So assume for a moment that In 2023, an independence-focused government is elected. One that will do a couple of key things. Introduce, for example, the Alberta Sovereignty Act. What will that do? That will take control of all federal programs that egregiously harm Alberta that we can within the Constitution, and also set new banking regulations for ATB Service Credit Union to protect depositors from CRA, as an example. But in that time period after electing a independence-focused government, you take control of policing, pensions, immigration, employment insurance, and provincial tax collection, which sets the stage for taking control of federal tax collection. Then, sometime between the election and the midterms, which is 30 months down the line, where the municipal elections occur, about 30 months later, either before that or at that time, you have that referendum on independence. Now, Alberta has negotiating power. Now, Alberta can go to Ottawa and deal with Ottawa and the other provinces and say, this is what we want, negotiate honestly for 6 to 12 months, and if Alberta doesn't get what it needs and what it wants, then Alberta unilaterally declares independence. Now, obviously, there's much more to it than just that. You'd obviously have to be in that period of time between getting elected and the referendum. You'd have to do other things. You'd have to be establishing discussions regarding new trade relations with the Commonwealth, with the United States and other nations. You'd have to be having discussions with respect to the military, etc. So there's obviously a lot of work that would be done there. But to get that leverage, ladies and gentlemen, that Alberta needs to actually chart a new path forward, what you can do is help us this way. What we want to do is grow this movement to 500,000 or 1 million people or more. And why that number? Because it's based on what I'm going to introduce you to, which you haven't perhaps heard before, which is the 3.5% rule. So the 3.5% rule was coined by a Harvard professor by the name of Erica Chenoweth. And what she determined after studying societal movements over a couple of hundred years, that 3.5% of that population can change the direction of that society. Now, when Jason Kenney and the UCP were elected, they had 120,000 members. That's exactly 3.5% of the voting public of 3.4 million people, the voting public. Now, if we grow the membership of the Alberta Prosperity Project to 500,000 or 1 million or more, then what that means is that's 15 to 30% of the population. That will absolutely guarantee that we can influence the outcome of the next election. And how do we know that right now? Very simple. A number of political leaders have been coming to us asking for our support. I posed the question to them this way. Okay, you want to lead this province? Okay, what are you going to do different to protect Alberta's interests, Albertans' individual freedoms and rights, Alberta's prosperity, and Alberta's self-determination? What are you going to do different that hasn't been done in the last 116 years? And there's only one person that has told me who can make that change. Now, I'm not going to say who it is because we're nonpartisan and we're nonprofit. But I see the hook is coming very close. So I'm just about done. So what I want you to know as well is that the way we're going to achieve this is we're going to be rolling out a massive multimedia educational campaign within the next couple of weeks. And we're going to be setting up 90 to 100 or more educational chapters throughout the province to spread the message. And what we need each of you to do is to consider what we are advocating for to protect you and future generations. Buy a membership. If you're able to make a donation, great. And consider setting up a chapter or two in your region. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, is fundamentally what the Alberta Prosperity Project is about, to inform, educate, and inspire Albertans on the rationale and merits of independence, how we'll make it happen, and how we will assuage the concerns of people about independence. So I know there will be a lot of questions, and we'll deal with those in the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.